When it comes to amps, you've got two main types. You've got tube or valve amps, which are the traditional types of guitar amplifiers, and you've got solid state or transistor amps as well. Jazz guitarists tend to use a mix of these. Sometimes they'll use both, or they'll switch from using one to the other over their careers. So a famous tube amp that many jazz guitar players use or like to use is a Fender Twin. Personally, if I go to a gig and they can assure me that they've got a Fender Twin that is there and the valves work and there's no weird sounds coming from it, I'll use a Fender Twin all day long rather than take my own amp, but that's just me. They're fantastic amps, but a con to having a big amp like that is that they're very heavy. So many jazz guitar players like to use some of the smaller tube combos, things like the Blues Junior, a PD Classic 30. These are all great lightweight tube amps which sound fantastic in most situations unless you're playing at very loud volumes, and even then you might be able to get away with miking the amp. The other type of amps that jazz guitar players like to use are solid state or transistor amps. There's many different types of these. Probably the most famous is the Roland Jazz Cube, and that was of course a model that came out in the 1980s, and that was used by Mike Stern and many players of that generation. Today most players tend to prefer using the smaller cubes, as once again they're lighter, more portable, and they sound okay for what they are. I think that they're a reliable sounding amp and you get a nice consistent sound from the cube, so that's probably the most popular option. Beyond that, you get jazz dedicated amps, so you get amps that are being made purely for the purpose of playing jazz on, and to me some of these amps have very coloured sounds, which can be a very good thing or a very bad thing from what you want depending on the guitar. Obviously, if you get something like a Strat or a Tele and you play it through a Twin, then that's going to sound like a Strat or a Tele. Of course, you can make it sound more jazzy by adjusting how you play and adjusting the tone and volume controls, but fundamentally that's going to bring out the sound of the guitar. Whereas a jazz amp such as a Polytone or a Henriksen, these tend to give guitars a darker sound, which can be desirable to some players. Of course, probably the most famous brand of classic jazz guitar solid state amps is Polytone. Joe Pass used Polytones, George Benson used Polytones, and they did a lot of promotion and marketing with jazz guitar players, and that's what I have in the studio right behind me. That's what I use for all my lessons and for most of my own practice. The reason being is because they're very, very reliable, they're very quiet, they're very small, they're very portable. I have the Mega Brute, which has got the 8-inch speaker, which personally I think is the best sounding amp, and that's great because if I'm teaching or recording or playing a gig that will be several hours long, or I can be doing an afternoon's worth of recording sessions, then I can just leave that amp going all day and I don't have to worry about it overheating, I don't have to worry about ever replacing the tubes. So it's a real workhorse for me, is the Polytone, but many of the other options which I've also mentioned sound fantastic as well. Let's talk about guitar strings. There's two types of strings that jazz guitar players use: round wounds and flat wounds. Flat wounds have no kinks in the strings, so you can move up and down the neck and get no string noise whatsoever. So some jazz guitarists absolutely love these because when you're playing things like walking bass lines, you're not going to get any unnecessary squeaks or string noise as you go up and down the guitar neck. One famous jazz guitar player that used flat wound strings was Wes Montgomery. Personally, I like to use round wound strings. On my archtop guitar, I like to use heavy strings because think of an archtop guitar like an acoustic guitar. You wouldn't use lighter strings on an acoustic guitar, and an archtop guitar is very much like an acoustic guitar in that sense. So the strings which I use on my archtop guitar there are gauge 12 to 52 strings. I like the D'Addario strings, but you can use whatever brand you like. I find that these are good because they give me a nice big sound, but I can also do things like small bends if I need to, and my fingers don't get tired playing the guitar for too long. So that's what I like to use on archtop guitars. On semi-hollow body guitars like a 335, I like to use a slightly lighter gauge string. The strings I like to use there are gauge 11 strings, and most jazz guitar players will tend to use a slightly lighter string gauge on something like a semi-hollow body guitar. Some people even like to use gauge 11 strings on a solid body guitar. So you can use gauge 11 strings on a solid body guitar and they have really good results. Some players also like to use gauge 10 strings on a solid body guitar as well. Next, let's talk about picks. Most jazz guitar players tend to prefer a smaller plectrum. A common example of a plectrum that you can get at any guitar store is the Dunlop Jazz 3, which is what I'm holding here. You can find these in black or red, and those are great, cheap, and very accessible. There are other variations of that come in all shapes and sizes, which are these type of plectrums right here, which come in kind of odd little teardrop shapes. That one's really kind of funny in how that's shaped, and that's more of your typical teardrop plectrum right there. Of course, you can get even bigger versions of those, and this is what a friend gave to me as well, so you can see that's a much longer plectrum there than the previous one. So I really recommend that you just get a few of these when you can and check out which one feels best for you. Now, after showing you all those fancy plectrums, I personally don't use any of those. I use another cheap accessible plectrum as well, and that's my trusty old purple Dunlop. I find that sounds the best for me, and that's where it comes down to. I feel like it's fast to use and it sounds the best, and because it's thicker, it tends to produce a warmer and fatter tone than the smaller plectrums. But of course, this is all subjective. I like to pick with the edge of the plectrum going against the guitar strings like that. There's nothing unique about that picking approach, but many jazz guitar players actually prefer holding the plectrum so that the longer part goes against the strings, and they say that produces a warm tone as well. So this is all subjective, and I highly recommend getting a few plectrums, trying a few different picking angles, and figuring out which one works best for you. Of course, you might prefer not using a plectrum at all. Wes Montgomery just used his thumb, Jim Mullen used his thumb. Some jazz guitar players like to use the fingers and get a great sound, and of course you can hybrid pick as well, which means using the thumb and the fingers. So these are all worth checking out because they can really affect your tone and how you play the instrument. I hope that you enjoyed watching this jazz guitar gear guide and you found it useful. Please let me know in the comment section below, what is your favourite jazz guitar setup? Do you like playing an arch top through a tube amp? Do you like playing a solid body through a solid state amp? What strings do you use? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd love to know what you think. If you found value in this video, then please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.